This is the Troutbitten Podcast.
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten?
Troutbitten.
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 Yeah, Troutbitten.
Troutbitten.
It's about trout. Wild trout. This is Troutbitten.
This is the Troutbitten Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Dominic Swantowski. I'm the owner of Troutbitten and the author of Troutbitten.com. So we are midway through this Troutbitten Podcast skills series on streamer presentations. And tonight, we're ready to take on jigging. So we've covered many things already about how we move the fly. We've talked about the streamer head position or its direction, about cross-current movement or holding one lane, jerk strips, glides, slides, fast, slow, quick, or smooth. We talked about drop rates and a lot more. And now let's talk about one of the most basic movements performed on any fly, any lure or bait, jigging. Moving the fly up and then letting it drop. It's such a simple motion that it might seem silly to spend much time on the topic at all. But like so many other good things in fishing, jigging is a world of its own. And there are, in fact, a multitude of variables to consider and to play with. So tonight we'll talk about angle, depth, and speed of the jigging motion, whether we have the fly crossing currents or we're keeping the fly in one current, and whether that jig is free falling or it's on a pendulum drop, and then a lot more. So let me introduce my co-host, Austin Dando, and we'll get this episode started. Hello, young love. Oh,
Hello.
that was good.
See?
Happy 30th birthday, bud. 30. 3-0.
Yes, it's got me.
Welcome to being an adult. You're an adult now.
It feels like it. It's a great, there's a Bob Dylan interview that somebody asks him to characterize himself. And he said, well, I characterize myself as well under 30. And I plan on staying there for as long as I can. I sort of related with that for a long time.
That's how you characterize
Still do,
yourself.
but it's passing me on.
What's changed? A couple days ago, you turned 30. What's changed?
I just did 30 chin-ups, 30 pull-ups, actually. So,
You want to tell everybody about that again?
I feel like, yeah, why not?
Okay. Yeah, why not? Let me tell you a little bit about me.
Family tradition is before you get to celebrate your birthday or receive any gifts, you have to do as many pull-ups as years you are old. So I've had the streak going since maybe I was, 11 or 12 when I first started. Because there's a window when you're not physically capable of reaching your age.
Okay, fair. And then there's a window on the other side of the window.
Yeah, there's another side of the window. It's...
You're not going to do 80 pull-ups at 80 years old,
I'm not
bud.
going to stop. I'm just going to keep going.
All right.
At 21 was difficult.
That's what you
And
told
now-
me the other day.
Yeah, and now the other day I did 31, one for good luck, and that was difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So I figured, well, maybe 41 will also be difficult, but possible.
Possible. It's possible.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Although, you'll
No.
be a father, though.
Yeah.
And Trevor and I were talking at the Super Bowl party, and you weren't there. So we were talking about you.
Mm.
And we were saying, Austin's about to become an adult. By that, we meant a father.
Yeah.
We were like, he thinks he's so busy now. He thinks things are, some things in life are hard now. Just wait.
I appreciate you guys talking about that.
Just
behind my
wait.
back, yeah.
I forget how it came up. We were like, he's about to find out. Yep. You'll see how much things change.
Yeah.
Everything changes. Nobody could explain it. Not that they should, but people say, "Oh, when you're a dad," they tell you all these things. When you're a dad, this is how it's going to be. This is how you'll feel.
Right.
Nobody can describe it. Nobody can
Right.
tell you how you're going to be a dad either. But
Sure.
it's, changes everything.
Yep. It's good stuff.
It is. You want to do a podcast?
Okay.
All right. Start with a question. I brought
gotta
this
get
one
an
over. Or I brought this was from through email. 2 days ago. I think it was Sunday. You gonna pour that beer or just drink right out of the can?
That beer was a little splashy. So, need a napkin.
What is it?
It's a New Trail 24/7 session hazy India Pale Ale, which is something that I've been greatly looking forward to. It's 4.72%.
Oh, you'll be able to handle the whole thing by the end of the podcast. You'll be all right.
You can have one while you're on the stream and feel no effect.
Session.
Yep.
Session beer. That's
Can have
what
a
that's
session.
kind of the
Yep.
definition, right? Like
Yeah, you sit down and you have a session.
low ABC. Is that the thing?
ABV, idiot.
I'm sorry. How about just reading the question?
About not telling me what to do.
Wow.
It's like a miniature Broken Heels. So it's quite good. All right. So this question comes from Emil Sonder by way of email. Hello, Troutbitten. I'm a big fan of your project.
Hey now.
This streamer podcast season is intriguing.
Hey now.
I hope you have planned to address what presentations can be done only with a sinking line. For me, all of the popular jig streamer stuff is not at all what I like about fly fishing.
Uh-oh.
Please preach to your audience that casting and presenting the fly with a fly line matters.
All right.
Was that a question?
That came from email. I got back to it too. Well, right. That's not really a question. You're correct. It's a comment. I would do this briefly. We're not going to preach to anybody. It might sound like we are sometimes, but we're pretty open-minded people. Nobody needs to be preaching to somebody else about, like how you should be fly fishing. And he says he doesn't like all this popular jig streamer stuff. Well, then don't fish them. But it's all right. And I mean, it was a natural fit for this podcast, right? Because we're about to talk about jigging. Now, I should say, and we're going to get to this later, we are going to talk about flies today because flies do matter when you're doing a jigging motion. But you don't need jig streamers to get a jigging motion up and down. You can do that with the sinking line. But as we're going to talk about, you can't do it nearly as effectively, or let's say with as many variations when you're committed to a sinking line. Anyway, what Emil is wanting us to do is tell everybody that they don't miss kind of the joy of casting with a fly line. Mm-hmm. And we don't. And even when we're throwing a mono rig, whether that's nymphing or streamer with streamers, we're still casting. We've talked about that a lot. We're not just lobbing weights around. And that's not what this whole podcast is about. But if Emil, if you want to go back and check all that out, maybe I'll leave links to like how you can use a mono rig like a fly line, like a hybrid system. Anyway, that's about it for that, right? Let's thank Emil. You want to thank him?
Thanks, Emil, for that question and comment.
There you go. Thanks for thanking him, Austin. You're right. I forgot about that. So jigging is a time-tested tactic that produces all across the fishing spectrum. Like every style of fishing that I know of, people jig flies. I mean, when I go to the saltwater and I'm using those bucktails, that's what I'm doing.
Right.
I'm bringing them up, letting them fall, bringing them up, letting them fall. When we get to the pendulum jig style, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So moving the fly, the lure, or the bait up before we allow it to fall has fooled fish from the beginning. Everywhere they swim. In fact, jigging might very well be the most primeval presentation. You like that?
Primeval.
Check out the show on Netflix, American Primeval.
Which channel is that on?
It's on the Netflix channel.
Netflix channel?
It's on the Netflix channel.
Okay.
Yep. It's good.
Look that up.
Anyway, meaning it's been around for a long time. Jigging. So, dunk the bait, lift it up, drop it, fish on. Just that easy, right?
And I set the hook.
And then I set the hook. Jigging our streamers, it shouldn't be missed. It's another movement that just seals the deal. It attracts fish in a different way. We're going to talk about all this because this rudimentary skill is a building block for many advanced presentations. I don't like that word advanced, but I might even put it in the title because the point here is that jigging too is not so simple. And maybe we'll find a different word than advanced for fishing. I never like the word advanced when we talk about fishing, Austin.
Right. It's sort of isolating and it's got an elitist tone.
Yeah, I'm better than. Oh, I didn't know you were better than me.
That's right.
You're advanced jigging.
I thought I was just regular jigging.
When you do have a handle on jigging, it does open up many other, I keep saying advanced presentations. Further on down the line, presentations. But the characteristic idiosyncrasies of fly tackle do make successful jigging a bit more nuanced. So lift it up and drop it, right? Well, not exactly that simple. All right, Austin. So what is jigging?
Simply put, it's
Up and down,
up and
baby.
down, right? Going up, bringing it back down. That's really what the heart of jigging is. It's a presentation that focuses on changing the position of the fly in the column in a vertical direction.
Right.
And because of that, it can be unique among our streamer presentations, I think, because
true.
most often we're thinking about crossing currents or holding one lane or maintaining a certain depth. But when you're jigging, you're thinking of depth changing quite drastically. Not always drastic, but that's the main focus. And again, the heart behind what we're talking about here. So
Up and down.
we note the position of the fly near the bottom or the top during all streamer styles. But with jigging, that change through the water column is sort of the meat of the topic itself.
That's the motion, right? Like you said, up and down through the water column.
Yeah.
That's it. Jigging. There we go. Now we can close up shop.
It doesn't need to be complicated, right? I mean, there's only two things to consider when we're jigging streamers, and that is how wide is the range of travel, and how well can you stay in contact during the drop. So how far is that drift, and then how well can you stay in contact during the drop, and then if you're doing multiple drops and lifts through that zone of travel, that's another thing.
I like that. So in addition, I will say that jigging can happen while you're crossing lanes. I tend to do it more staying in one lane, casting upstream, and then letting the fly come down in one lane.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about whether you hold in one lane or you crossing lanes. You're going to have more control over the jigging motions. Out of all the things that you just mentioned, Austin, you have the most control when you keep the streamer in one lane.
Agree. I think that's just a matter of physics.
Sure, because tension from crossing lanes, tension on the line, going across and cutting through the tippet, really, cutting against the tippet, is going to take away some of your control. You're going to be at the mercy of the currents in a way.
Yeah.
That said, like I was out fishing today, and they were eating better on a cross current. I don't know if I was jigging necessarily, but a cross current strip and letting it fall, And you know what? That is kind of jigging, because as I would strip, it would come up and then it would fall. And you talked about how drastically is it falling?
Yeah.
Well, mine was falling pretty slow, but it's a jig. Technically, that's it. It's up and down. When I would strip, it would come up through the column, I'm going to say 10 inches, and then I would let it fall.
Yeah.
And then I strip again, and that's about the pace I was on. Strip.
Did you say you're going cross currents?
Yeah, I was, but it was slight.
But still,
so over 30 feet, let's say I might have been crossing 5 feet. Is that fair? You understand what I mean, right?
Yeah. So that is pretty slight.
Yeah, pretty slight. I mean, depending on how we look at it.
Sure.
And I just mentioned about casting upstream. And I would assume that most people, when you think about jigging in a river, you're thinking about casting upstream. But you can jig with a downstream approach. I used to say, well, you have to cast upstream when you're jigging, but not really. And again, I was thinking about this the other day when I was out fishing, because I was letting the fly hang. And I had a pretty heavy fly on.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I would let the tension, and I wasn't in real fast water either. And so when I would let the tension off, the fly would fall. And then I'd even maybe give it a little bit of slack so it would fall more.
Right.
And then I'd pop. And there it was. It was climbing through the column again. And then I'd let the tension off and give it a little slack, and it would fall. And that give and take it's a jig, up and down, up and down. So if we are just clearly going by the definition of what jigging really is, up and down, then it applies maybe a lot more than, I used to think, and that maybe most people are just thinking about. Oh, this is jigging. Well, maybe just up and down is jigging.
Yeah, that's a good example too of how it's possible and not just an upstream approach.
Yeah.
And how it can be pretty simply performed in a basic way, downstream as well.
Yeah. Whether it's after a fishing trip or at a backyard fire, you can bet the Troutbitten crew has a case of New Trail Broken Heels along with us. It's honestly our favorite beer. This hazy IPA is smooth and full-bodied. Hand-selected Citra hops lead to notes of bright clementine and juicy ruby red grapefruit. Broken Heels is a keeper. New Trail beer is proudly brewed in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and delivered cold to your favorite craft beer retailer every week. At New Trail, it's not about being the best angler. It's about getting out there. So enjoy nature's moments and reward yourself for a day well fished with New Trail Broken Heels. It's Troutbitten's favorite beer. The landscape is changing for trout anglers. No doubt you've already noticed another truck at your favorite access point and seen more anglers on the water. For those looking for new challenges and fishing opportunities, Trout Routes has the data to help you avoid the crowds and explore new public water. Trout Routes has mapped more than 50,000 trout streams across the country with curated, detailed maps of public land and access points. Trout Routes has developed integrated and interactive data, putting the tools in your hands to research new water and help you navigate in the wild to know exactly where you stand in the current. It's still up to you to find those deep pools and undercuts, but Trout Routes helps you get on the water, connecting you with resources like fly shops and stream gauges for trout water across the country. Download Trout Routes in the App Store today. Then use the code Troutbitten for 20% off your membership at maps.troutroutes.com. Yeah, so a lot of that really comes down to the weight, right?
Absolutely. I think probably the weight is the most important part of any underwater presentation, but especially jigging. It has to be there somewhere, in the system to get the fly down.
Gotta have weight. Try jigging without weight sometime.
Yeah,
We know how that goes.
It's really fun. And a lot of anglers, I'd say maybe they don't have nearly enough weight in the system to do any real animations with the streamer. And jigging requires more weight than most presentation because the fly needs to fall back down when we jig it up.
Yeah.
And relating back to my previous point, if you're going to have more than one jig throughout your drift, there needs to be enough weight in the fly for you to come back up, you to regain somewhat of a contact or an understanding of where the fly is and drop it back down and move it back up again. That has to react fast enough to be able to do it more than one or two times within the same drift. And the weight does that.
Yeah, that's awesome to point that out. So important. And like you say, it has to fall back down fast enough so that you can jig again.
Yeah.
And if you want to get 10 jigs within 30 feet, up, down, up, down. Well, then you have to have enough weight so it will fall down. If you have a very lightly weighted fly or a lightly weighted system, then you're only going to get 2 jigs, let's say, like up and down and up.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what
exactly.
I mean? Yeah. So now you said enough weight in the fly. And I'm going to, disagree with you a little bit or just elaborate more on this. I don't mean to, don't get mad at me, Austin, for disagreeing with you. Okay.
I am 30. I know everything.
That's right.
I didn't. If I didn't before, I really do now.
That's good. So, weight does not have to be in the fly. It can be in the split shot. It could be in a sinking line. We're going to talk more about all that in a minute. But you also said that a lot of anglers maybe they don't put enough weight. Yeah, they don't. I guide a lot, right? And so do you. And we see it. I'll have people show me their streamers that they plan to jig with, and they're not adding split shot, and they got like a 3mm bead on there.
Yeah.
That's not going to fall down quick enough. I don't care how small the rest of your leader and system is, thin everything. It won't fall fast enough if you have. I hate to just say it won't, but if you have a if you have a 3mm bead on there, you're kind of handicapping yourself. Don't shy away from weight. We had a whole podcast on all the different styles of weight, and we said it makes no sense. Well, I said it never made any sense to me when people would say, well, I just use just as much weight as I need to. I don't want to use any more. I always err on the side of less weight than more. Like, why? You're already using weight. Use what you need to get a real jig. So just everybody pay attention for 1 minute. People make fun of me for weighing things, but I want to give you some reference.
Okay.
Let's say the weight is in the fly or a split shot. Let's say the weight's in the fly. So 40 centigrams really isn't much at all. And yeah, I go by centigrams because I'm going to use split shot and beads. But here, I got you. So 40 centigrams really isn't much at all. 70 centigrams starts to be enough. And many of the flies we're jigging with are a full gram or even 1.5 grams or 150 centigrams. Or more, right? So for reference, here we get into bead sizes. For reference, a 4mm tungsten bead weighs about 50 centigrams. And I said that's just kind of becoming enough. It is enough to jig in some slower water, not real deep. Okay? 4mm tungsten bead. And then a 4.5mm bead is 75 centigrams. These things start to rise pretty quickly.
Yeah, wow.
You get a lot. Yeah. That's a 75 centigram, roughly. They're all a little different, whether it's slotted or who made it and how much tungsten is in there, whether it's 95 or 97%. Sure. But it's about 75 centigrams. Then a 5.5 millimeter bead, which is getting pretty big,
Yeah.
That weighs 1.3 grams.
Okay.
So 130 centigrams. And remember, once you add in the hook and the materials, and maybe some lead wraps on there, a fly with a 4.5 millimeter tungsten bead is over a gram, usually. Now, if you compare that to a pretty heavy stone fly, in a lot of people's box, they'd have a 4 millimeter bead on like a number 8 stone fly, and
Yeah.
they think like, this is my bomb nymph.
Right.
This is the one I use to get down. That's only like 70 or 80 centigrams. And again, we're talking about using 150 centigrams commonly in some of these flies. But we're telling you that it's needed to get a lot of the presentations that you can get with a jig, to get, those 10 reps, let's say, in that 30 feet. And to really have a good contact system, to do good contact jigging, and definitely to do a pendulum swing and stuff like that. It doesn't have to be, an absurd amount of weight, but I'm saying 1 gram is not at all absurd. So even though some of that might sound heavy, it's not. And if you compare that, really, I was thinking about this today. If you compare that to the gear world, for example, like a 1/32 ounce is the lightest rooster tail that they make, like an inline spinner, a rooster tail. I think everybody knows.
Yeah.
But it's rare to go that light, and like 1/8 ounce or 1/16 ounce lures are much more common. And then let's say that one of the most common bass lures, and they use it for everything, is called a Ned rig.
Mm-hmm.
And the most common size of that is 3 grams. 3 grams. And that's without the weight of the bait. That Ned rig is like a rubber lure. It's about the size of your pinky finger, right? And that lure itself weighs about 1.5 grams. So you have like 5 grams you're casting out there. Oh, and the Ned rig is, something you're jigging up and down.
Yeah, exactly, right.
A lot like what we're doing with some of these heavy-headed flies. And people want to try to do it with 50 centigrams. You can't do it. You can't do it. You're going to be limited if you handicap yourself by going light. Was that too much? Was that too down in the weeds there?
No, I
Austin?
think that's actually a really good visual.
I think we might have lost some people. Just cut the audio. They said, forget it. I'm out.
No, I think you throw those numbers around here and there, talking about, I was fishing with 50 centigrams, and I just couldn't get down. Then I added a split shot, and it weighed that much. And that's useful within the context of maybe a nymphing riffle. But when you're going through it and comparing it to also the gear world and putting in a little bit more of a perspective of the 1/32 ounce is the lightest thing you can get, and then the Ned rig in which they're doing some of these jigging techniques is going to be up to 3 grams. Yeah. It's a really eye-opening difference.
Yeah. It's not even
what
up
we're trying to describe.
That's a pretty light Ned rig.
Sure, maybe it's like the starting, or right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So no, I really like that breakdown.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
See,
I feel better about myself.
Say nice things about you.
Once in a while. So there are 2 parts to the up and down we've been talking about. Let's break it down then. When you're lifting, let's assume that we're going to lift off the bottom. Now, these are assumptions. You can jig at any part of the water column. But let's assume that a lot of people want to get down, maybe even touch the bottom, and that's our first goal. And then, so you cast the fly, you allow it to touch the bottom, and then you begin jigging. Lift the fly and allow it to fall again. And you brought this up earlier, Austin, like how far up should we jig?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, sometimes a few inches.
Right. And I think just like with anything in fishing, it comes down to a bit of experimentation and figuring out what the fish want that day. So maybe they're eating with a slight jig a few inches off the bottom and back down, and that's where they're at. Maybe they're eating mid-column and jigging it up a little bit further, or maybe not even going all the way down on the drop to the bottom is necessary. They may be eating it halfway down through the column. So there's no hard and fast rule. It's more or less probing your water and seeing what the answers are.
Yeah. Now, different rig setups, whether you're using a floating line or mono rig, other things, they're going to give you more detail or understanding about what your fly's really doing under there. And I will say it's very easy.
More sensitivity.
Yeah, good point. And I'll say it's very easy to exaggerate a jigging motion. If you lift your arm up, or if you lift your rod tip up 2 feet, that might be too much. Maybe the fly is lifting up 1.5 feet or even a foot. Once you take into account the other things that we're going to talk about. Mm-hmm. But so to actually get just a 3 to 6 inch jig up, I think it's pretty subtle, and it might take more refinement than people expect. I'd say the best way to do this, to really learn it, is get a visible fly. And let's say you do put the weight in the fly.
Yep.
Take the rig of your choice, yes, and then fish a foot of water with the sun on it. At the angle you can see. And then play with it. Just play with it and realize what your motions are really doing to that fly. Sometimes you'll be going, oh man, I'm actually taking it out of the water in that foot of water. Like that's too much then,
Yep. Yep.
And so if you really want to learn to jig it just 3 inches up or 6 inches up, it's going to take some refinement.
Yeah, I try to like minimize my arm movements and maximize just the rod tip movement, right?
Good
and
point.
just control with the rod tip. Don't use your arm as the vehicle to jig.
Tiny bit of wrist,
Yeah.
maybe some elbow.
Yeah, maybe a little elbow in there.
You like that? I said earlier, like I like to find the bottom first. More accurately though, where I want my fly is in the strike zone. We've talked about this a lot with nymphing. The strike zone, very briefly, is a cushion of water that's on the bottom. It's like its own little river down there, and it's going much slower than what you can see on the top, right? And let's just throw a number out there and say the strike zone is, from the bottom and maybe 6 inches up, maybe 10 inches up, but it's not a foot and a half tall, right? But there's a cushion of water there. It's being broken up. It's gone slower because it has to hit rocks and tree parts. It's gone slower. We know all of this from nymphing concepts. And now it really helps me to take that understanding of that slow current down there. Really all the good stuff in a river is happening down there. That is where the trout are holding because they're efficient creatures and that's where they are. And that's where I like to keep the jig. And that's why I don't want to jig it up a foot or a foot and a half. I like to just jig it 3 to 6 inches. So I might find that bottom, and then I'm going to try to stay off the bottom a lot of times and just jig through. Now, that's my favorite way to do it. There's not endless. There's a bunch of other ways, though, to do it. You could jig right up above the strike zone if you can be very accurate.
Right. Like you said, it's the place to start. It's not the place you're going to only jig in, but it is a good starting ground.
Yeah. Sometimes, too, they're eating on the drop. That's a big deal.
On.
If you cast it in and you're waiting for the 1, 2, or 3 seconds, whatever it takes for your fly to fall and touch that bottom, and a fish eats it on the drop, well, then I might start jigging up higher. Or casting more so I can get more drop. But a lot of times I'll jig it up high. I mean it, mid-column, and then let it fall. And then jig it up to mid-column or higher and then let it fall. If they want to eat it on the drop, I'm going to give them more drop time.
Right on. I think that just parallels really well into kind of what I was trying to describe earlier, is that you never know exactly which way they're going to want it each day.
Yeah.
And by being explorative with those jigging.
You find yourself a new word there, bud.
Yeah. Was that a word?
Yeah, it is.
And by being a little explorative with your jigging locations within the column, you can sort of start to dial things in.
Yeah, right on. One more thing to wrap up this part on lifting. We're talking about lifting up higher so it can drop further because trout are eating on the drop, and that's cool. But I will say, if trout are active enough to eat on the drop, then I find that trout will be even more responsive to cross-current jerk strips and other animations. That's really my signal. Not to maximize drop time. And that might be the first thing I try, but it gets me excited. I'm like, whew, trout are coming off the bottom and they're ready to eat. So I'm going to do other things. Usually, I'll just do what I consider to be more fun animations, quite honestly. I'll jerk strip. That's me.
Yeah, that's cool. Fish are on the move.
Yeah, exactly. So let's move on to the drop. That's the other part. There's the up and the down. And we're talking about how we can drop the fly. There's some things to this. We'll talk about contact jigging, slack jigging, and pendulum jigging.
Yeah, and trout, of course, eat on the drop. Quite often, they're eating on the drop, whether it's our jig stream or it's our nymph. Right? We see trout eat on the drop a lot. That's the trigger.
Yeah. So to be clear, what I was just talking about a second ago was kind of that initial drop. The fly goes in, and if trout are eating it on that initial drop on its way down, like I said, then they're pretty active. What you're talking about is kind of once it's down there and we start animating it, whether that's a couple inches up, 6 inches up, maybe even a foot up, kind of at the most for me, then that drop, that right there is the trigger.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot through this streamer presentation series about the different triggers built into these animations. Well, the drop is definitely the trigger in a jig. they hardly ever eat when you're bringing it up, but then they eat on the drop. It's predictable. They rarely eat when you're bringing it up.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So I said these different ways of jigging. What it really comes down to is, do you want to stay connected through the drop, or do you want to be slightly out of touch? So contact jigging or slack jigging. Either of them is good. Either of them can be the answer. So there's kind of two different ways to do it, maybe three here when we add in pendulum. But if it's performed poorly, without attention to the details, then a lot of the strikes are going to be missed if you're too far out of touch, especially. And you might not get as many strikes. You might not be entertaining the fish as much if you're doing the wrong kind of drop for what they want.
Yeah, so let's hit on contact jigging here first. And, I first learned good jigging by fishing heavily weighted lead head jigs for smallmouth bass. That's how you learn it best, in my opinion, is just being in touch pretty heavily with that lure, with that fly.
In contact.
You get an immediate response as to what your fly is doing and where it's at pretty much all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to raise the fly by lifting the rod tip and then lowering it back down to its original height, letting the fly drop or fall.
Yeah, right on.
And we try to match the speed of the rod drop to the speed of the fly drop, really.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the secret to contact jigging, because it's a clean transfer of energy all the way through.
Mm-hmm. You made a good point about those bass jigs. Again, they're always heavier. That Ned rig at 3.
They always feel way overweighted now when I go back to use them.
Yeah, but there's a reason that the bass guys have them that heavy.
Yeah, exactly. It makes sense.
It does.
Like, this is maybe how it's supposed to work.
Exactly. And that extra weight is going to keep you in contact. I like what you said. You're basically just putting the rod back to it as you're dropping. You're putting the rod back to where it was, up and down where it was. Yeah, as you're dropping, you're trying to stay in touch. That's what contact jigging is. And I think it's easier, like you said, to learn it that way. For me, excellent polarized lenses are a critical piece of gear every day that I'm on the water. Tajima Direct has changed what I see in the river. Tajima Direct offers top-tier lens replacement services with the best polarized lens technology on the market. They offer both prescription and non-prescription lenses, so you can upgrade the lenses in your favorite frames with purpose-built lens tints that are specifically developed for fly fishing. Check out my 100-day gear review article on the Troutbitten website. Tajima's patented technology cuts glare and enhances clarity like no other lens that I've worn. I especially love their low-light specific yellow-green 40 polarized lens, which is perfect for early mornings, late evenings, and the cloudy days that we all enjoy so much. Tajima Direct offers excellent service and the best lenses on the market, along with much better pricing than your local eye doctor can offer. Clear vision and more detail with less strain so you can see more fish. That's what Tajima Direct delivers. Visit tajima-direct.com. That's TAJIMA-direct.com. Upgrade your lenses and see what you've been missing. For over a decade, Smith Creek has designed and built outstanding gear for the serious angler. Smith Creek's net holster is the perfect solution to hold your favorite net. I've been using mine every day on the water for over 9 years. Its ergonomic design helps you draw your net quickly when you need it, while keeping your net firmly in place and out of the way when you don't. Made from rugged materials and hand-assembled, Smith Creek's net holster is built to last. All Smith Creek gear is backed by their outstanding customer service no matter where or when you bought it. To stay up to date on their latest specials, follow Smith Creek on Instagram at SmithCreekNZ. Quality you can depend on from a brand you can trust. Smith Creek. And then slack jigging. Let's get to that. If we drop the rod a little faster, rather than staying in touch with the fly, then we're introducing some slack. If you went up and then basically down just as fast as you could, right back to where it was, you're going to literally introduce some slack. Now, we're not talking about 1.5 feet of slack. It's just inches of slack. And it is if you do it right, it's managed slack, right? If you only lifted 10 inches and you drop 10 inches real quick, then the most that you've introduced is really, 10 inches. But in reality, it's only going to be a few inches of slack. Here's the thing. That fly falls very different under a slack jigging kind of approach rather than contact jigging. The fly tilts more, if you think about it. And let's say we're back to a kind of a traditional heavy head jig. That fly is going to tilt. Even if you take an unweighted fly and you put split shot 5 or 6 inches in front of it, or even 10 inches in front of it, that fly too is going to tilt more when you allow slack in the system. So the split shot drops faster, drops harder, let's say, and the fly is going to tilt more. So it's just a different look. You get that up and down, that head up, head down. It's that tilt. It's that natural jigging motion, not just going up through the column, but the head changes. The head position changes, even with just a split shot and unweighted fly, but especially really accentuated with the heavy-headed fly.
Yeah, and we may end up doing a lot more slack jigging than we realize or maybe intend to if our flies are underweighted for the tactic itself.
That's a good point.
You know, if the fly doesn't have enough, or if the split shot doesn't have enough weight in, or whatever supplemental weight, or whatever weight we have in the system, isn't enough to make the fly drop with contact, then we have to introduce slack in order to release that tension and allow the fly to drop through the column. So if you find yourself always having to drop your rod tip and let a bunch of line down and wait for that fly to straighten out, well, that's going to be more slack jigging than it is contact jigging.
Yeah.
And the way
it has to be. Yeah.
Yeah, there's not really a good way around that. So,
well, without adding weight, right?
So by nature, then slack jigging may sometimes create more strikes, but then they're harder to detect because you've got slack in the system. And again, unless you're starting your jig back up, or that fish has taken enough slack away in your line on the eat for you to realize it quickly, you can miss a lot.
For sure. So one more type then is the pendulum jig. And I really started doing this, again, fishing bucktails in the surf with a gear rod. I'm not fishing a fly rod. I'm fishing a gear rod. The bucktails are 1/2 ounce usually. So much heavier than what we're talking about.
Heavy,
It's crazy, right? Yeah. And the surf that I'm fishing it's not like it's over my head, the water depth is everything's different. But anyway, so pendulum jig is, you're going to jig it up. Then you're going to leave the rod up as the fly falls. So you bring it up, and then you let the fly kind of come toward you, really, as much as it's falling. It's going to track towards your rod tip. So the fly, of course, is connected to the line, and it tracks toward the rod tip. You do this in slow water to see the results. And honestly, I tend to pendulum jig in slow water more than the other two styles. So instead of the fly falling vertically, this pendulum jig, it's falling on an angle. It's coming toward you more. And in reality, I think most of our drops with a jig, especially when we're doing this contact jigging that we talked about first, I think usually it is kind of a pendulum jig. It is coming towards you.
Sure. We need some angle in there.
There is some angle in there. Unless you're right under your rod tip, you're not getting a vertical jig.
Yep.
And of course, rig and everything matters too. Well, we should talk about that.
Yeah, then let's get to the lines and leaders.
All right. So we've been saying throughout this podcast series that our focus is on how we want to move the fly. Like most of these presentations can be done with a variety of lines and leaders. But for jigging, I do think it's fair to address some important things. Jigging can be executed with a floating line or a sinking line as well. But there are some key differences to understand. And your fly may not be lifting and dropping just because that's what you're doing with the rod tip. We just talked about this. Yeah, it's going to track toward the line,
Yeah, and the more leader and or line you have under the water, the less effective really the jigging motion becomes. You got to ask that question, is it really going up and down or not?
Yeah.
And when we lift the rod tip, the fly follows the line, not necessarily always the rod, right? The line is what's guiding it first, and then eventually to the rod tip, but more line equals a less vertical jigging motion in general.
Yeah, and further away then is always going to mean less vertical. The only way you're getting a true vertical approach up and down is if you're literally right under your rod tip. And you said floating line and sinking line, and really nothing beats a mono rig for jigging. You can't beat it.
Yeah, I agree.
And really a micro mono rig provides the most vertical jig at the longest distances. Now, you might not need or want real vertical jigs at long distances, and all rigging choices come with a compromise. And then you think about this, the polar opposite of a micro mono rig approach would be a full sinking line. Kind of back to Emil's question. You just can't get a fly lifted and then falling very effectively, very much, not dramatic in almost any way, when the sinking line is under the water like that.
Right, but the fly can still be lifted and allowed to fall, right?
Right. Up
And
down.
somewhere in the middle is a floating line and a 9-foot leader.
That's true. Yep.
But whatever rig you choose, be honest about what's really happening when you lift the rod tip.
Yep.
And work within the strengths of that choice.
We say that all the time. Doesn't matter if you're fishing dries, nymphs, wet flies, you're fishing at night. And yeah, here when you're fishing streamers, you got to know the strengths and weaknesses of your rig and fish within that framework. Do things that that rig does well. Choose tactics that rig does well.
All right. So how about flies then?
Well,
that's lines and leaders.
I guess. And here we are talking about flies and lines and leaders, and we promised that this series wasn't going to be about that.
That last guy's question, he really grabbed the wheel.
Yeah, I guess. So I said it before, any fly can be jigged up and down. It's just up through the column and down. Might not be a whole lot. But if the fly's too light, then add split shot. I said I fish an unweighted fly. One of my favorite things to do is take a bunny bullet, which is a deer head sculpin for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it does have some weight, but if you put it on a gram scale, it might weigh 20 centigrams. There's a little bit of weight to kind of keep it balanced, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't tilt back and forth. Yep. I like it that way. And I will fish it not on a jigging approach, just real low to the bottom and kind of crawling around down there with the split shot. And that's my point. You have to have weight to get down, and that fly can't do it itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I could use a sinking line, but I like to use a mono rig. And I'm going to say 2 number 1 split shot. That gets me to 60 centigrams. Great. That'll get me down in like knee-deep water that's gone walking speed. Cool. And that split shot then is what I'm really fishing. Okay. That's why I am not going to put the split shot 20 inches away.
Right.
Because I could lose a lot of strike detection. But anyway, I've jigged with every streamer in my box. I don't know if that's exactly true. I've jigged with every type of streamer in my box. You don't need jig streamers to jig up and down. It's just a motion in the water.
That's right. And they don't always need to be streamlined either. If we think about it, maybe a modern jig streamer, they're often very minimal on materials and bulk, and they're designed to just cut water really fast. Same reason that we fish thin nymphs sometimes. But just like you previously stated, that doesn't have to be the case. It's mostly about the weight and what either leader or line you're using in combination with that weight.
Yeah.
Things like rabbit strip often can be something that really softens a jig and hold a column well. And that can be a really good look too. This is a lot like the difference between, again, a thin perdigon and a bulky, fluffy mop fly.
Yeah. A perdigon wants to drop and drop and drop. And when it gets to the strike zone, for example, I wish it would stop dropping.
Yeah.
Okay? And I can help it along, but okay, that's what a perdigon does. It always wants to drop. Like I said, a mop fly really doesn't want to drop so much. But you get enough weight, you get it down, no problem. Most mops have a 4mm bead or 3-4mm bead on them. They get down. And then once they're down, you can much easier kind of just keep it coming through that strike zone. Well, it's the exact same thing here with these streamers. And we are talking about jig streamers now. And I will say I prefer more streamlined ones, right? Without much bulk.
Yeah.
But only slightly prefer. And some of my favorite.
It's easier. It's more conducive to the tactic.
I don't know if it's easier, but it's a different feeling. Once it gets down there, I feel, you said softens. I feel like my motions with the rod tip are softened a bit. That's good. So it takes more effort then to bring it up 6 inches. Yeah, and maybe then having a more streamlined jig does make it easier, as you said, to bring it up through the column. But maybe I don't want it like that. The truth is that rabbit strip, like the Dirty Stripper, the guys from Connecticut that we talked about a couple podcasts ago, that's a really cool fly. I was using that today, and I'd get it down on the bottom. And honestly, that rabbit strip and the laser dub that's on there allows me to just kind of keep it, I feel like I'm just jigging it within a 3-inch up and down. And I like that motion. And then if you'd go back to back with something like Gunnar Brammer's Pheasant Bugger, which doesn't have much material on it, it just goes right back down. It's a more pronounced, let's say, or more dramatic tilt to the fly, and it's up and down through the water more when the fly is more streamlined. So streamer design matters. And as I'm talking about, with either streamer, I do like to keep it in a strike zone. I like to find the bottom and then just jig in the strike zone. I don't like to come out of it necessarily. unless I have a good reason to. Once I'm down in there, I just like to work that strike zone. And I might come across seams. I might hold one seam, but I like to just keep it jigging, kind of little animations. But there's a lot to that. I mean, sometimes I'll hit the bottom every time. I'll go up and then let it hit and then come back up. Other times I just want to glide right through and up and down, up and down. So we can also jig in the middle of the column. Doesn't always have to be the strike zone. I don't do that very much, but it doesn't mean it's not a good tactic. It's just not something I do. But I might allow my fly to fall into the middle and then start jigging all the way through the middle, up and down, up and down. You ever jig right in the middle on purpose?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like we said before, the strike zone is the go-to. And then maybe I work my way up from there. So eventually I may find myself jigging in the middle and then jigging up towards the top third of the column. But that's the way I find out where they're eating, right?
Top water jigger.
Upper mid column, upper mid third. Yeah.
Upper mid. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, sometimes, but it's not the go-to. Sort of just where you may end up.
I like it. Anything else, Austin?
I think another thing to consider here is when we're actually making the lift. When we're actually making the lift, we can also decide what sort of intensity we do that with, whether it's a quick,
that's true.
a quick drastic lift,
Yeah.
or a real smooth and steady lift. And those are both options. I think maybe in our minds we picture jigging as, hard up and down, hard up and back down. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can do a slow raise and let it drop again, a slow raise and let it drop again. So just another thing to experiment with, really.
A lot of variables for a simple technique, right?
Yep. Advanced jigging.
There you go. Now we're all advanced. All right, there it is. Jigging. So things seem to be getting a little more complicated as we go along. But the goal of this streamer skills series remains. How do you want to move the fly? What animations to the streamer not only attract the trout, but also convince them to solidly eat the fly? Jigging is just another in this large set of movements to mix in while fishing streamers. And it's a good one. Next time, it's speed leads and lane changes. Austin Dando, will you read us out?
So remember, the Troutbitten Project is a free resource for all anglers. The Troutbitten website hosts over 1,500 articles, videos, and podcasts with endless stories, commentaries, tactics, tips, and more. It's endless.
Endless.
Find what you like through the top menu and through the search page. Navigate by way of the categories and tags too.
Go ahead.
Be sure to find the Troutbitten YouTube channel, now featuring the Troutbitten Tip Series, Fly Fishing the Mono Rig, and the Troutbitten Fly Box, all in collaboration with Wilds Media. You'll also find the Fish and Film videos and the new Riverside series, all in their own playlists on Troutbitten YouTube.
Hey now.
Thank you for listening to the Troutbitten Podcast. Please give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a comment because it really helps.
They've been very nice comments lately.
We like those. Until next time, friends, fish hard, enjoy the day, jig hard, and find your life on the water.
I need a t-shirt that says jig hard. You know the best fly to jig with?
Jiggy. Craft for jiggy?
The jigged, jigless, jiggy. That's the best one.
It really is.
You're so smart, right?
Yeah.
You come up with all the good ideas.
30 now.
20 years younger.
Yeah. I'm still working out.
Pretty dumb.